Welcome to Pete's Property Podcast, brought to you by Buyers and hosted by Pete Wargent, buyer's agent, finance and real estate expert, and all-round property guru, plus published author. Join Pete for 30 minutes as he chats all things property with a new guest each week. Learn practical tips from the movers and shakers in the property industry and well-known personalities sharing their property journeys.
G'day, welcome to this week's episode of Pete's Property Podcast. Got a very special guest this week, Steve Sammartino, a futurist. So first and foremost, we're going to get Steve to explain to us what a futurist actually is. You get some of these special guests on the podcast and it's difficult to even know how to introduce them. I guess futurist, entrepreneur, author and TED talker. What do you reckon, Steve? I think that's a pretty good start. What do you think?
It's good. The left out TV host on my TV show on Channel 9, but I'll let you off.
Yes, I made some bullet points and I thought, well, you've got one of those very long CVs.
Yeah.
One of my good friends, Dom Price, is a work futurist at Atlassian. And the question he gets more than any other is, what is a futurist? So I guess my understanding of what a futurist would be is somebody who looks at patterns of economics, demographics, and tries to make sense of what's going on and what's coming next. Is that something like what you do?
Gee, you're really close. I mean, for most people, they just think about technology, but it's much more than that. And so the way that I look at it is I'm actually an economist by trade. So I studied economics at university and even taught at Melbourne Uni for a period of time. The way that I look at it is the lens of economics, human behaviour or anthropology, and technology, right? I put those things together. And it's not about predicting the future. It's actually about considering plausible trajectories and then understanding the way things could go in a few different areas, socially, geopolitically, technologically, economically, and how those things overlap so that when whatever happens eventuates, you've considered all of them, right? So that's what it's about. It's kind of like a form of planning which leans a little bit more heavily into deep social trends and technology trends. So the way I frame it, simple, is economics is the numbers, the business, the incentive structures. Socially is human behaviour. That doesn't change. We've got a 200,000-year-old DNA. It's like our brain, our software is a computer that hasn't had an upgrade in 200,000 years. The human behaviour and our desires don't really change. We think they do, but they don't. And the other one is technology, and that's in a rapid state of change. And the way that I define technology is really simple. It's the tools we use to get things done, right? So a chair is a technology, a pair of shoes is a technology. But right now we've got heavy computational technology and artificial intelligence and material science, and they're reshaping the economy because people use technology to make more money or disrupt industries. And people adopt technologies because it helps them do things like connect socially or get work done or those anthropological things. So that's what I weave together. And depending on the business or who I'm talking to, I look at those various trends and go, well, these are the couple of likelihoods in this area and this area and that area. And of course, property is one of those things that I'm very interested in and talk about a lot because where we live is a big part of human existence. It really shapes everything.
Yeah, and we've seen some interesting demographic shifts, particularly over the past couple of years with the regional renaissance, which we'll come on and speak about shortly. I guess one of the interesting things as it relates to economics and markets, there's this old saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I think you've probably elucidated the reason for that. And it's when property markets and stock markets and economies go through their cycles, it's the same human emotions and fear and greed and the same behavior patterns just repeating over and over again. But I guess as you touched on there, it's what actually does change is the tools that we're using at the time and the technology. So every cycle might have the same sort of feel to it, but there is always different nuances to every cycle. So I often hear people sort of, when they're talking about very sort of niche or exciting careers, like they didn't choose their career as such. They kind of were just felt as though they were guided in that direction by what they were interested in. But is that how it came about for you, that you were a futurist?
It came to me. This is really true. I mean, I worked in marketing because not many people who study economics work as an economist. So I worked in corporate for about 13 years in various marketing roles, got to some senior levels, advertising consumer goods. But when I did a startup in the Web 2.0 era, I built some software and built a rental engine startup, which I ended up selling to a rental car company, but I sold the software, the back end. I was trying to do a consumer eBay, people renting things to and from each other, but I ended up selling the software to a rental company. It was called rentoid.com. And as part of that process, I started really investigating quite heavily and reading and researching a lot about the change in the economic structure that happened after the dot-com crash, because a lot of people said, oh, it's all over now. I was just really interested in it. I started blogging, writing. I was doing a tech startup. I'd worked in big corporate, so my old corporate friends kept inviting me back to, oh, can you come and give us a talk for my team on this topic or that topic, because I'd been in both spaces. And then when I worked in advertising, I used to do a lot of keynote speeches to about technology and changing technology to win new clients. And then I had like a book publisher come and say, oh, can you turn that into a book? And I had a speaking agent say, can you represent me to speak? And they said, what do you do? I said, I just talk about business and technology. And my agent goes, nah, you're a futurist. You get 20% more calling yourself that. So I said, all right, let's go. And then that was it. It stuck because I just went, I'll go with it. It's funny because I don't really like the name that much because it's got that wank kind of sound to it. But which is why I explain it in that economic sense. It's not about predicting things, but it's really just a certain viewpoint. So kind of, you're right, man. It happened to me. I didn't choose it, and I was so sheepish about it, using that word. But then I just said, just embrace,
Well, it's definitely it's going to be a talking point at barbecues, if nothing else. Really it gives you an intro to people. Look, this is the sort of chat where when reading through your bio, there is so many different areas and subjects that we could talk about. But in the end, it's a property podcast. Let's talk a bit about your journey in property. Now, I was delighted when we chatted the other day to hear we've got a couple of things in common in the real estate market. I'm a property owner in Geelong, which I took the plunge and bought there when everyone was saying last one out, switch out the lights in Geelong when they were closing the car companies down there. Yeah. And it's been a great part of the world. But also the last couple of properties I bought a couple of agricultural properties and also a beach shack. I bought a beach shack over in the UK because I figured a lot of people couldn't go overseas for holidays anymore with all the testing requirements. So I'm thinking that with your skills as a futurist, you obviously try and look forward and try and identify some of these trends, and this would no doubt lead on to your own investing and strategy. So tell us a bit about your journey in property and how you use your skills as a futurist to try and benefit your strategy.
So I'll tell you, the first property I ever bought was a disaster, and that was when I was really young. I was 18, and I bought like a shop that was a takeaway shop, the freehold on that. And I bought it based on yield because the yield was good. And I made a really bad mistake because what happened was the business went broke and I couldn't rent it back out again. And I ended up losing my dough on it and selling the property at a loss. And really the lesson I learned then, and you get the best lessons with scars, is don't buy on yield on paper unless you think that yield would be a reality if those people left could you rent it out quickly again for that price point. One of the dangerous things you see, guaranteed yields. Well, you're just buying your own yield and your price point. Usually, right, that someone's funded. So that was the first one was a mistake. And then it took me a few years to get back in. And the thing that I look for is arbitrage, right? That's the one thing I look for is arbitrage. So I want to look for things that already have high value in a different yet similar place. And if it happened there, the probability of happening in the other area is likely. And so the one thing that I did was in Melbourne was an east-west arbitrage. I looked at the price of places in the inner eastern suburbs like Paran and so on, those inner suburbs, Richmond. And then I looked at places like Yarraville and Kensington, and they were like half the price. And the houses were really similar. Yes, the infrastructure wasn't quite as good, the cafes and all of this. And this is about 20 years ago. And I said to myself, there's no way that can be maintained because proximity to the city was more important than the east side or the west side like it used to be. Right, and I think that happened in London and New York with Brooklyn and the east end of London. It happened in Sydney. I lived in Sydney and I saw Balmain, which was in the inner western suburb, was 3 times the price of Yarraville. I looked at Yarraville and I went, Yarraville's got to be a lay-down misère. And I just went, I'm just doing that. Like, it's not as complex as people are trying to find some trick. Just use your own eyes and see what you think, right? I did that, and I remember I bought my first house in Yarraville, and I think it was 120,000. That place is worth 1.5 million now. You know, I mean, obviously 20 years ago, so, and we've had boom times, but just the sentience of mind to go, how is this similar to that, and what are the price differentials? That's a classic arbitrage. So I've bought a few properties in Footscray, Yarraville, Kingsville, those kind of areas, Kensington, in the inner west, and I've done really well out of that. And that was it was arbitrage. And the one thing that I noticed too was looking at technology and population growth and demographics was, well, the thing that's interesting is proximity to the city is more important than east or west, and wealthy people don't want to spend their time in cars. And so that's kind of the conclusion that I came to, is time is the only asset you can't get more of. And, the average commuter in Melbourne and Sydney pre-pandemic was spending a full workday in the car. So I did that. That was the first one.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of key lessons there. I always try and tease out a few sort of insights or lessons from these podcasts. Well, I guess the first one there is a good rule of economics. There's no free lunches. And if there's a very high yield on offer, it doesn't matter whether that's in property or, I don't know, if you're buying a Greek government bond or I'm trying to think of another example. Certainly in Australia, mining town property was a big thing in 2011-12 when some of the yields were 15%. But I guess you can't sort of buy on the assumption that yield's going to be sustained just exactly as you said. And very, very often a very high yield represents a risk of some sort. So I guess that's a good takeaway point. I often say to people, property investing, sort of 90% of it is common sense. I remember in London, my younger brother went to live in Bethnal Green when it was all sort of a Bangladeshi sort of suburb, and all the signs were in Bangladeshi. But it was 10 minutes walk to the city, and a fraction of the price from some of the more sort of traditionally well-to-do suburbs to the west. Exactly the same in Sydney. Like a lot of Poms, I lived in the eastern suburbs, where all my mates started moving to Newtown. And I thought, well, gee whiz, if all my mates are moving there, then there's got to be something in it. And I bought a place in Erskindale, exactly the same principle as you talked about. So in terms of some of the recent trends that you're seeing, Steve, the regional renaissance is something that you actually predicted. So who do you think will benefit from these shifts, and where will be the kinds of locations that will be the main beneficiaries?
Yeah, I wrote a white paper on this about 6 years ago or 5 years ago, saying there's going to be a regional renaissance. There'll need to be a shift for it to happen, and COVID was it. But basically, and I want to explain why, the tools of the day through human history have always defined where we live and work. The tools of the day. I'm going to get really anthropological here, right? So when we were hunters and gatherers, the spear, right? So we're mobile. We live where the herd is. We follow the seasons, right? And we live light, and we live in caves, and we move around. During the agricultural era, the seed, so we settled down, we have little farms, little villages. During the era of the industrial age, the spanner, so we moved to the city, and that's when inner city little single-fronted houses happened in cities like London and Sydney and Melbourne, and we all worked close in to the factories. We had to be, within distance of public transport or bicycles or walking, because no one had cars. This was pre-car, right? Then when the car happened, what did we have? We had suburbs and shopping centres, and the suburban sprawl happened, right? So the tools have always defined where we live. For 20 years, the major tool of manufacturing has been silicon, right? Which means for the first time in history, most people can live or work anywhere. Half of the population can live or work anywhere. But for some reason, we're hopping in a traffic jam all day long to then get to an office and say, hey, hi, Bob, hi, Tony, and just tap away on a computer. It didn't make any sense. So I'm like, well, there's going to be a regional renaissance. Doesn't mean you go and live a million miles away from a city. Within 1 or 2 hours of a major city, satellite centres, Newcastle, Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo, all of these places places that usually have something that is beautiful about it. It's got a nice mountain or a nice lake or a coast, those types of things. Those places within an hour of a major city or 2 hours of a major city are going to go gangbusters, right? Because they're half the price of the same house in the city. You've got a higher standard of living, and you can also work for a big corporation. And so instead of actually buying the houses there, I've bought big acres, So in Geelong, I bought 110 acres for the same price that at the time when I bought it for a 2-bedroom piece of wood in Yarraville. And again, that's arbitrage. I'm like, okay, if I could ask 2 people on the street who don't know anything about property or property prices and said, you can have this or you can have that, which one do you want? Right? And they can look and go, well, Geelong's here and it's got jobs and it's got a city and it's got a bay and it's got a coast and there's a university and there's an airport and there's, and then there's all these acres. I bought 110 acres, right? And then there's this little 2-bedroom piece of wood single-fronted house in Yarraville. Or you can have that. Which one do you want? That's a really good question for investors. Ask a 7-year-old, which would you rather have, this or this on the property? And I just went, yeah, I'd much rather have that, so I bought it. And that's turned out incredibly well too. And and the long-term play is obviously to develop it or have a developer sweep it up. But in the interim, I've put a house on there and make a nice little weekender Airbnb, like a country property kind of thing.
I remember reading a report a few years ago, Infrastructure Australia, saying, well, these are the locations that will benefit from investment. Obviously, the capital cities were in there, but there was a range of what they call peri-urban locations,
yes.
Which basically within 2 hours of the capitals, exactly like you said, Bendigo, Ballarat. I think they threw in there Toowoomba, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast.
Yeah, Wollongong and a lot of these places. And they've got really high standards of living. And you've got, like, in some ways, industries that now support this. A lot of the industries that got, let's say, eaten up or swallowed up by big conglomerates in the 80s and 90s, now you're getting things like microbreweries opening back up and micro-manufacturing and all these other little sort of cottage industries developing out because they've got access to tools of manufacturing overseas and shipping things with e-commerce. And so I think that this is just the start of the start, and there's still a lot of upside in regional areas because, you just need to think about just imagine that you could work anywhere. Where would you rather live? That's the question you've got to ask. Not where you work today, because that'll change. And likewise, I think inner city apartment blocks, they're going to suffer a bit because a lot of the offices are going to be reconfigured, which is going to increase supply. They're going to be reconfigured into housing because offices will change their shape. They'll be like places that we go to 2 or 3 days a week, but we don't spend time there. Houses will look more like offices, and offices will look more like houses. There's a convergence, almost like the old cottage. You used to have the bakery up the front, and you'd live upstairs or out the back, or you'd be a wood turner or a carpenter. It's a little bit like that again now, but now we're digital craftspeople. So
I think that's probably already happened to some degree. If you look at some of those places in Melbourne, like the South Bank or South Yarra or the CBD, I think apartment rents have come tumbling down. There's no students around. There's no tourism at the moment. I guess this is probably the number one question, I guess, for property investors and probably more broadly for employers over the coming years. I take myself as a case in point. When I first came to Australia, I said, look, I'm never commuting again. I've done it before in London for a couple of hours a day, just dead time. And I was like, I don't care where we live, but it has to be within 10 minutes of the office and the city. So I lived in Bondi Junction for 6 years, lived at Darling Harbour, so I could walk to work for 5 or 6 years. That changed, though, when I was able to run my own business, and we ended up moving to Noosa ultimately. Exactly as you said, it's a nicer place to live probably than an inner city area. You've got lifestyle, but you've still got other stuff on your doorstep. You've got the coast, coffee shops, and so on. I suppose this is the question that a lot of people are grappling with at the moment. Obviously, the pandemic has caused a lot of people to be working from home. A lot of the big tech firms are telling us they have to offer flexible working arrangements. Otherwise, they just wouldn't be able to hire. There's just no talent around. So are we going to go back to offices again? Will people just be going in 2 or 3 days a week? Will things go back to normal, or will people be working in more remote communities and working from home?
I think we're never going to go back to the 5-day-a-week office ever again. It's just never going to happen again because the utility is incredibly high for both the employees and the employer. The employer can reduce their office costs dramatically. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to be working from home forever. And a lot of research has been done. I work with the Innovation and Productivity Council of the New South Wales Treasury. I'm on the board there. And we've done 2 surveys on it, deep, robust surveys. And most employers and employees want a hybrid where they get to go to work a couple of days a week because you definitely need social interaction. You need to bounce ideas, but we don't need to sit there and work next to each other. So I think we're going to see a real hybrid model where we connect, collaborate, plan work, but a lot of the work probably will happen outside of that. Of course, this can't be every job, but about half of the jobs. And so offices will change their shape. And we're never going to go back to full-time 5-day-a-week office because I just don't think anyone really wants that. And there's an incredible upside. I mean, some of the financial upside, with properties is that local businesses get a chance to thrive and pick up some of that money that otherwise wouldn't be spent because you go to your local coffee shop or you spend money locally. So there's big upside. You reduce travel time, you get more family time, all of that. And I think that the cubicle farm, as I call it, I don't think it served us for a long time. The reason that offices exist is because photocopiers used to cost $100,000 and be useful, right? And now you've got like a laptop, you've got higher tech in your house than you have in your office. And so it's just legacy thinking. And it's management sort of having that draconian control idea. Look, if you have to control your staff or watch them work, well, then I'd really question and say, well, you obviously got a question about why they're there. If you can't say at the end of the week, these are the objectives, have you achieved them? If you have to watch over them, you've got a bigger problem than them being in the office.
Do you want to save on buyer's agent fees? You could save thousands with Buyers Buyers. As Australia's most extensive network of buyer's agents, we can lock in highly competitive prices. Plus, our national network of buyer's agents are some of the best in the business. So get the Buyers Buyers advantage and talk to us today. Call 1-800-975-051 or visit buyersbuyers.com.au.
For skilled staff in Australia, wages can be pretty high in global terms. And I think if people aren't delivering with their skill sets, employers might maybe outsource some of that work, because if they can outsource it to Noosa and Geelong, they can probably go further afield into Asia as well, where wages are lower. But I guess we'll see how all that plays out. But certainly less office space per employee is what the way things are heading.
It's a really interesting point, Pete, because if everyone goes, oh, this is scary because if we go online, then there's this potential for draining work going to low-cost labour markets. That's already happening. It's been happening for a long time anyway. But the flip side of this is that no one's really talking about the idea that all of a sudden I might become an investment banker or a marketing manager for a job that was historically based in New York, earning US dollars and earning more money, and then bringing that back into this country with a different type of arbitrage. Arbitrage is a two-way street, and all we do is look at the negative. So if you're a young upstart with a lot of skills and you know the company has a work-from-home policy, it's even a PR opportunity for the company. We employed a young, really smart lawyer, girl in Sydney or something. You know what I mean? Like, why does that have to be a one-way street? There's a positive upside on that now that a lot of American companies have a work-from-home policy. We've got to really be thinkers.
I see your economics degree came in very much in handy there. I've spoken like a true economist with the benefits of trade. And of course, every transaction has two sides. And I think this is one of the things that's been keeping inflation low, I think, in recent years. That some of the outsourcing, you haven't had to have somebody sitting in the office for 5 days a week when you can get stuff done by outsourcing much more quickly and efficiently. Now, Steve, one of the things I wanted to check in with you, because this is an idea that's been bubbling around in my mind for a long time, but I don't have any special insights here. And this is on the technology side of things. So I've been staying the last couple of weeks back in Bondi, my old stomping ground, as I mentioned, and the place I'm staying is just a short stay service department. And I was looking around the development. I was like, I'm sure there used to be 2 towers here, right? And then there's now 3. And when I looked a bit closer, what they seem to have done here is added a 3rd tower, which is pretty much a prefab or some kind of modular build. And I've been thinking for a long time that the world is going to move towards more sort of modular or prefab techniques, but then in particular, 3D printing. Now, I know you've had an interest in this area, and I've been wanting for a long time to interview somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. So tell us a bit about what 3D printing actually is, and then what does that actually mean for the future of housing? Will there be more low-cost housing built and more affordable housing through these new modern techniques?
Yeah, so I think there's a delineation between those two different ones. First one is modular and prefab. And I think there's some really smart stuff happening now. I'm building a modular house on my farm with Modscape, who do prefab housing, really architectural, nice stuff. I think all the volume builds in the long run, volume builds will be modular and prefab. I don't think we're going to have people laying bricks and constructing frames on site very much. I really don't, because the economics of prefab in a factory and then bringing out the pieces of the Meccano set and putting them together is just far more economic. And I think you can get your money can work harder to give you a nicer design by embracing sort of almost like a Lego mentality with prefab applications. And the technology and the materials are getting a lot better. Also, the connectivity of, you know, the way you can put things together digitally now, and it doesn't have to be all built on site. It can be pulled apart and then put together. So I really think that's the future with volume builds and general greenfields housing. 3D printing, I'm also 3D printing a house on my farm as well. So I'm doing a whole lot of property experiments on there. I've worked with a few 3D printing companies, but I've settled working with Slick Build, which is a young entrepreneur in Melbourne who's built a 3D printer. And everyone's seen a few of them around. But essentially, it replaces the concreting and the bricklaying process. We can 3D print already in more than 300 materials. You can even 3D print diamonds. So it's quite incredible. The thing that's interesting about 3D printing is that in the long run, we'll be able to use different materials in different parts of the print, so that when you're building a house, you'll be able to print wires and electrical componentry and all sorts of stuff into the house when it's done. So it has all of these incredible opportunities. The other thing that's interesting with 3D printing is we get complexity for free. So 3D printing houses and construction is going to end up in two interesting areas, which is really ironic. It's going to end up in really low-cost housing and really expensive housing. So the low-cost housing, to be able to whip up an emergency house after bushfires, or low-cost housing for whatever the need, it can be done really, really cheaply because there's no labour. It's a 3D printed swing arm that can go, or a gantry that can just print the buildings in a day or two, right? Just prints them. With concrete going straight in, it's special formula concrete. So it's really good for low-cost housing. And I think it might even be anywhere between 50 or 70% cheaper per square metre. So it's really cheap than bricks, much cheaper than bricks and sticks, as they say. And then the other area for 3D printing is, let's say, Toorak or Vaucluse, those kinds of houses, or something beautiful in Noosa up on the hill, because you can bring a 3D printer up and print somewhere which is really, really hard to get to with bricklaying or other forms of concrete. And just like printing on a piece of paper, you can print the Mona Lisa as easy as you can print a black square. The printer doesn't care. And it's the same with 3D printing concrete. So a lot of the beautiful facades that we used to see in the commercial areas in places like Sydney and London and Melbourne, the beautiful old buildings, they make a comeback. A beautiful concrete fence in Toorak, that can be done without a craftsperson, which is incredible and beautiful and visual. So it's going to be those two separate areas, incredibly bespoke and unique, or low cost, high volume. And then I think the prefab stuff will be the mainstream building.
So, yeah, this has been one of the really interesting things over the years, because people have said, well, why don't we build enough housing, and why is there always a shortage of family appropriate housing? But I guess in the end, developers have been price takers rather than price makers. So they buy land bank it for years, and then they just drip feed new builds onto the market because there's no incentive, of course, to overbuild and bring prices down. Do you think with things like cheaper printing technologies and the ability to actually build at scale, do you think affordable housing can be solved with 3D printing down the track, especially if people are working potentially more remotely as well away from the city?
Look, I'd like to be more positive about the technology on reducing house prices, but I think we all know that the cost of the land versus the cost of the building on top of it is the major issue. Yes, it will bring things down in terms of a manufacturing cost, no doubt, because all forms of automation, whether it's in cars or building computers or tables and chairs, automation and artificial intelligence always brings the cost of goods down, right? We know that. But with housing, it's unique because you've got that land component and that scarcity. So I think to have low-cost housing, and it's a major issue, homelessness and lack of affordability on housing. I mean, it's a big topic in the news and politics, tax benefits, all that kind of stuff. It feels like you need to have more land released. And I really think that if the government was serious about it, they could do better and more projects on low-cost housing for people who can't afford it or homeless people, and probably would need to involve governments commandeering land or using government land in a new way that hasn't been done before. So it's a bit of a challenge. I don't think technology is going to solve that problem. I think it's more of a geopolitical issue and the government wanting to do it more than it is the cost of building houses, even though that's not cheap.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have unfortunately, some first-hand experience of trying to get a planning approval on a block that we've got, and it's taken 2 years so far. And people can submit complaints and comments, and you get knocked back by the council, and you think, well, no wonder there's a shortage of housing if you can't build on a flat block of land. But and also look at cities like Canberra, and you think, well, gee whiz, there's an awful lot of land around there, but the price of land has just kept on escalating because it never, as you said, never really seems to get released for residential use, or certainly not quickly enough for the demand. Now, Steve, I saw a couple of years ago, I think it was in one of the Fairfax newspapers, and somebody had done a mock-up design of how Melbourne might look. I'm thinking this is sort of mid-century, and it was this amazing artist's impression. And there was, big tower blocks, but not just in the CBD. They were all over the place, and this great big sprawling city. But I guess nobody really knows how the world might evolve over time. But I guess it would be remiss of me to have a futurist on the podcast and not ask you the question. So if we were to get in a time machine, let's say 10 or 15 years into the future, how do you think things might be different over that kind of a timescale? Will we be living in different ways, and what might actually look different?
Yeah, so Sydney and Melbourne. I live in Melbourne, so I'll give the Melbourne viewpoint, but it's probably an allegory for any city. I think cities are going to be more places where we live and get entertained and less about where we work. That's going to be the major shift. And it's mostly going to be a reconfiguration process of buildings. For me, it's inevitable that the CBD of Melbourne, it'll be illegal to drive in there. They're going to be designed for walking, shared commuting, little pods, that type of thing. Toyota's got a really interesting view of something they call the E-palette, which is the city of the future, which is really, really interesting. The woven city. You can see it on YouTube. It's called the woven city. It's pretty cool. And I think that we're going to see things like vertical gardens. We're going to see car parks at the bottom of these big office towers change their shape and become micro warehouses for e-commerce deliveries. So you're going to see a reconfiguration. They'll kind of look the same, but they'll start to look a lot whiter with the buildings and a lot greener. One of the big movements will be the ZEB movement, the zero energy buildings, where building equals power plant. There's a company that comes out of Perth called Clearview who make windows which are solar panels. It's extraordinary technology. And so every building will generate its own power, its own water, it'll grow its own food. There'll be more people living in the cities and getting entertained in the cities, less people working in the cities. And I think they'll be reconfigured, the buildings, the car parks, and it'll be spaces for humans eating, being entertained, interacting, walking. There won't be anyone driving. It won't be gridlock in the cities. It's going to look less like a concrete jungle and more like an urban jungle with greenery and humans.
Yeah, we've seen a few of those buildings already. There's, if you look around Chippendale and some of those tower blocks, and I think Atlassian is going to build one in the tech hub in Sydney. So I guess if that gets replicated across the city, it'll look a more pleasant and greener place. So to bring it back onto the property question, let's say you've got a hypothetical $1 million to spend on property today, but you've got to use it or lose it. Where would you look and take an investment if you had that opportunity today?
If you could get acres within 2 hours of the city, I'd do that. That'd be the first one. My second one's a weird one, and this is my next purchase, is an Art Deco apartment, one-bedroom apartment, close to the city of Melbourne or Sydney. Art Deco apartment, one bedroom. The reason is that single-person households in the next couple of years will be the most common household in Sydney and Melbourne, and no one really builds single-bedroom apartments anymore. And the Art Deco ones are really interesting because they're usually on big blocks in beautiful old suburbs like South Yarra. And often if you can get one that's got less than 8 or 10, if you add up the value of all of those single-dwelling houses, they usually would be far less than what that block of land would be worth on its own. So again, that's an arbitrage. It's there to be seen in plain numbers right now. You can get them for about 470,000, 500,000, a beautiful one better in Melbourne, 600,000. If you look around, they're there. And I think they're incredible value. I want to do one where I buy all of them in one of those blocks, because then you could turn it into a giant, beautiful home after that, just knock the walls out of each of them. So, yeah, they're the two options I'd go for.
Yeah, I was chatting to Stuart Weems from Pro Solution. He's a Melbourne boy, and he said pretty much exactly what you just said. The unit market in Melbourne has had a rough run, I guess, since around 2012, because so many new units got built with all the Chinese investment. But as he said, land values have increased, and in many cases, the sum of the parts is not as much as the whole, so to speak. And if you can pick up some of those units, you're effectively buying below the land value or below market value.
Yeah, you are. Those Art Deco ones, because they're quite beautiful and big, and they usually have nice garden areas, and they're heritage protected, which means that, you know, that they've got incredible value.
Yeah, and this is one of the things we've done as buyers agents over the years in Sydney is buy Victorian terraces, for the simple reason they can't build them. They can build lots of new high-rise towers and so on, but you can't replicate a Victorian terrace, and the same applies, no doubt, to the Art Deco style one-bedroom apartment that you're talking about. There's a few around the lower North Shore of Sydney that would fit into the same category. So, Steve, I think we could talk all day about futurism or futurology or however you would like to term it. But if people want to find out a bit more about your stuff, where should they go for more? Because I know you cover a lot more than just property and demographics. It's the whole gamut of anthropology and technology and economics. So where can people go if they want to find out some more?
Yeah, just go to stevesammartino.com and you'll see my blog. There's sign up to my blog. I do a post once a week. I do a technology essay once a week on a topic that if you read that and just that, if anything comes up in the boardroom or across the dinner table, you'll be across it. You know, everything from crypto to NFTs to artificial intelligence and robotics. I cover all the big things, and I'll put thought into it, and not just here's the latest news. It's like, here's the technology, here's what it means for people and work and industry. So that's kind of what I do, and anything else I do, that's the middle point where I can point you to the other stuff. So that's the place to go.
Fantastic. I had a bit of a newsletter cleanse to kick off 2022, but I am a subscriber to the Steve Sammartino blog, so eagerly awaits those regular email updates, and we'll watch your property picks with growing interest over the next few years. So, Steve, thanks so much for coming on, and we'd love to have you on again to get an update on some of your thoughts on where things are headed. And thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really enjoyed the chat.
Thanks for listening to Pete's Property Podcast, powered by Buyers. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as Pete chats all things property with a new guest. And just a reminder that the information provided in this podcast is general advice only and doesn't take into account your personal financial situation or needs. You should always consult a licensed professional to discuss your individual personal circumstances.